And then there's this accelerationist idea of, sure, maybe the master's tool will not tear down the house, but what if there's no other tool than the master's tool left? Like, I think that's the sort of the pessimistic
Well, that's
interpretation
the Landian.
of
That's Landian accelerationism. Like basically, go as hard towards not only just fascism but destruction as you can, and we'll have to figure something else out.
no, but I think it doesn't have to be as extreme as Landian to have a thought like this, where you think like, okay, sure, I want to do something about neoliberal capitalism, but the only tools that I can use to do something about it are neoliberal capital tools, and not like I can as in I want to, but like those are literally the only ones available. And I don't know if I agree with this 100%, but I do get where people are coming from when they say that.
I get
Because
the
also
impulse. Like
Deleuze and Guattari,
I'm not disagreeing with the
yeah,
impulse. Just there's a lot of lines. Deleuze has been called like the father of accelerationism by some, and other people have pushed this idea that they were both hard accelerationists, and obviously their stuff spawned a great deal of that vein of thought. To me, there's just a lot that they talk about in here that I don't see how the principle follows, and that they even talk against the idea of self-contradiction being destructive. Like,
yeah, but funnily enough, maybe the contradiction that then Deleuze said that also didn't kill the idea of accelerationism. The contradiction never killed anyone also applies to the accelerationist idea within Deleuze's philosophy, I think.
right. Well, that would, I mean, that would make the point that contradictions can't kill things. Therefore, like, it's just, it's worth having a longer discussion over. I definitely have maybe a different opinion than on many, but I'm, definitely it'd be worth discussing. But for now, we'll go ahead and kick off because we do have a shorter and thank God easier chapter this week. Prepare yourselves for next week. But I'll kick off. Hello, and thank all of you for joining us at the Deleuze and Guattari Quarantine Collective's ongoing reading of Anti-Oedipus. Today we're going to be going into section 3.8, the Urstaat. The Urstaat, whatever. The Urstaat, which is luckily shorter. We're going to be having a whole other set of discussions around a little bit more next week. This should be a little bit easier. I don't have a major set of announcements today. I'm kind of mostly skipping them because it's pointless for the most part. But I do want to suggest anyone here, please jump up to Divagations in the DGQC section. We are putting on a little conference. We'd love all of you who are hearing this, would love to have you join and be a part of this and take part in what we're doing. It would be wonderful and lovely. All right. With that, I think we'll just kick straight into 3.8, which is the Urstaat. Again, easier section. I think a lot of it is really crisp and clear, and as such, it's also shorter. So many graces befall us today, even though there's a decent amount of Orientalism in this. That's fine. We'll make our way through it. As always, if you have questions, don't hesitate to yell at us and say so. Don't hesitate to write something in the Anti-Oedipus chat or in the YouTube chat or wherever you happen to be. We are around. I'll go ahead and give it a read. The city of the point of departure of Abraham, or the New Alliance. The state was not formed in progressive stages. It appears fully armed, a master stroke executed all at once. The primordial Urstaat, the eternal model of everything the state wants to be and desires. Asiatic production, with the state that expresses or constitutes its objective movement, is not a distinct formation. It is the basic formation on the horizon throughout history. There comes back to us, from all quarters, the discovery of imperial machines that preceded the traditional historical forms, machines characterized by state ownership of property, with communal possession bricked into it, and collective dependence. Every form that is more evolved is like a palimpsest. It covers a despotic inscription, a Mycenaean manuscript. Under every black and every Jew there is an Egyptian, and a Mycenaean under the Greeks, an Etruscan under the Romans. And yet their origin sinks into oblivion, a latency that lays hold of the state itself, and where the writing system sometimes disappears. It is beneath the blows of private property, then of commodity production, that the state witnesses its decline. Land enters into the sphere of private property and into that of commodities. Classes appear, inasmuch as the dominant classes are no longer merged with the state apparatus, but are distinct determinations that make use of this transformed apparatus. At first situated adjacent to communal property, then entering into the latter's composition or conditioning it, then becoming more and more a determining force, private property brings about an internalization of the creditor-debtor relation in the relations of opposed classes. There's actually a lot in that first paragraph, isn't there? So if we go back, the city of is actually worth looking at. It's in Iraq now, I believe. It's this idea, this first paragraph is simple. It's this idea that the state is not something that slowly grew over time, that like Lacan would talk about language, that you enter into it wholly, that there's no such thing as partially being within language. The same would be true of the state. Once the state exists, its core basic form here, the Asiatic production being the state organizing small fiefdoms, kingdoms, tribes inside of its control for a larger organization. That structure isn't distinct, is not unique, is not one thing over another. It's not over time it shifts in lots of pieces, but instead comes at us instantly full force as a core form of organization of larger societies. The form evolves, changes slightly, but ultimately comes back to the way that this first sort of state, the Urstaat, formed and how it functioned. It's kind of the first half of this paragraph. Any thoughts, questions on that? Am I wrong? I'd love to know if I'm wrong. This one is, again, I think a little easier, and there's a lot of really good secondary literature I've read, so I have some confidence. I'll leave the awkward silence for a moment to allow you to jump in.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would say, as I read it, it looks like they're reworking some Jungian psychology here. Because when you read the Urstaat, one's reminded of Jungian archetypes, and this is interesting because there's an important condition that makes the Urstaat possible, right? So we know that the Urstaat, if we follow Deleuze and Guattari, the Urstaat was not formed in progressive stages. It appears fully armed, master stroke executed all at once, right? So it just kind of shows up in a sense. But why does it show up? And then they will, you're right, what's the condition for it? The previous sentence, the city of the point of departure of Abraham or the new alliance. With the shifting of the socius to the despotic, one finds the conditions for this archetype, or this, whatever we like to call this, the Urstaat, to actually not only be possible, but to take over, well, I guess we'll get to what it does, but to basically make the despotic operations of overcoding possible.
Rocket test, please, if you have something. I'm going to probably mute you, Rocket Test. I think you don't know you're unmuted. No, I think you're spot on, Jack. And again, I think it's an easy start here. Again, this entire section so far up to this point, this chapter, has been about defining out and building out that universal history. This idea of how contingent smaller bits, how the machinery we live in today has been built piece by piece, some pieces getting left behind, others growing. And the Urstaat is a unique one, as there is as a representation, as a level, as an organization, it just pops hard into existence. and as such, it kind of sits there underneath everything, and it starts affecting everything sort of full force right away. The second half of this, which I really think is important to go through, is the beneath the blows of private property, then of commodity production, that the state witnesses its decline. Land enters into the sphere of private property and into that of commodities. Classes appear as dominant classes are merged, but are distinct determinations. These elements slowly sink and become part of and are organized differently, sort of within the Urstaat in different ways that the state has instantiations. But ultimately, this is what the state does, is organize these things and handle these things and sort of give rise to, at first situated adjacent to communal property, then entering into the latter's competition or continuing it, then becoming more and more determining force. Private property brings about an internalization of the creditor-debtor relation. The very concept of private property stems from this larger Urstaat and how it sort of works in the latency with which the despotic starts to play. Because itself, I had this the last time we went through this, as a sort of location and as a base of all of this, is really this classic Sumerian city-state. And it was, I mean, God, 4,000 BC? One sec, let me pull up the page. Because it's kind of important. When was founded, the Persian Gulf's water level was 2.5 meters higher than today. Is thought to have marshy surroundings. It's, generally speaking, Iraq. The whole setup behind all of it and how it sort of operated is so fucking old. It's just wild. The city, said to have been planned by Ur-Nammu, was apparently divided into neighborhoods, with merchants living in one quarter, artisans in another. Streets wide and narrow, open spaces for gathering, many structures for water resource management and flood control. Houses constructed from mud bricks and mud plaster. In major buildings, the masonry was strengthened with bitumen and reeds. The division of all of this, when we start talking about, again, here, 4,000 years BC, houses, the districting of labor, the movement of people into different areas, all of that being done at large, planned by Ur-Nammu. Sounds like a comic book villain, but actually is the founder of the Sumerian Third Dynasty, big major leader. And he built state, like he did that. He created one of the first legal codes, I think, maybe the first legal code we know of. This is the emergence of, and it's why they use the term the Urstaat. It happens to be the first, the primordial, the beginning, also happens to be the first state as we know it and as has existed since then. And that's a lot of what they're getting into, is that there's this second part, which is as this emerges over time, what enables the latency. Well, it's literally the next paragraph. I'm going to just jump to the next paragraph unless anyone has any comments or questions.
Yeah, it seemed like the city of Ur is painted as a sort of what you could consider a communist, planned economy state.
I think central economy is not more planned for sure. I don't know if I'd say necessarily communist. I'd have to dig really deep into the setup, but it's more towards the primitive. Again, these aren't. We didn't have primitive one day, despotic the next, and then capital the next day. Like, things don't happen like that. And that's, again, part of their universal history. The pieces of these things grow and ebb and flow. And so as we move from the primitive to the despotic, the state is part of that journey and the creation of the state. And it's literally actually the next part, because, it kind of gets into the next paragraph, but it's, what is the setup, the ancient city-state, which is a very commune-based setup? Why does it push things? Rocket Test nailed it. It's the notion of markets at this point didn't exist yet, so it resembles communism. It resembles would be the big sort of emphasis word there. So it feels like it, I guess you could also say.
Right. Okay, that makes sense. I think maybe after the next paragraph, I have another question.
Yeah, and Jack, I think
Yeah,
you're sorry. Please, J.K.
the notion at the end where he ends that paragraph with creditor-debtor relation that is internalized. Is that is that a transformation of the master bondsman relation or master slave relationship? And so the classes, the relation between the different classes are kind of devolved into this, you know, this kind of master bondsman.
I mean, it's possible. I'm not super familiar with that. I think more this is a reference specifically to when they were talking about the primitive and how the creditor-debtor relationships were deeply dynamic and were constantly, built up and then expelled and expended, and that setup was very much almost a one-to-one across a society, very rarely like upwards or downwards in terms of class mobility. Whereas with private property, suddenly you had a internalization of literal class dynamics. Again, when we start talking about how was planned, itself was planned, houses were constructed, people were put in different districts based on the work that they did with different levels of niceties, or nearer to the palace or nearer to that. So suddenly the creditor-debtor relationship, which worked differently before, now had this new dynamic. Not only was there like now a commodification of property, which is weird in and of itself, but the privatization meant that this creditor-debtor relationship became applied to these classes, and that shift is a significant one.
Right, because you're moving from debt relations to credit relations.
Rocketest asks, what is Asiatic production exactly? I mean, there's a whole Marxist thing on it. My very simple version would be, once upon a time, there were lots of singular tribes. Asiatic production is the shift from being only working within your tribe to being ordered on high by someone far away who says, your village, you build rocks. You village over here, you move the rocks to village 3. Village 3, you carve them. Village 4, you move them to place X. Village 5, your job is to place them and build a giant wall, which is, I think, the example actually they use a few times. That is what they call Asiatic production. We might call it planned economy or central planning as a concept. I mean, there's more to it a little bit than that, but I think that's a simple version. Anyone want to add to that or correct me?
I guess I'd say I think the coming paragraphs will help us open it up a little bit more. In a word, I think of Confucius when I think of Asiatic production, or like the later empires in that. But of course, there's a point they're making here, which is that the Urstaat's not only conditioned by the despot socius, right? That's a condition for the Urstaat to happen, and as we'll see, as it carries into capital, right, it'll be even more critical. A few things to highlight here would, I think, be that the Urstaat serves as a horizon, right? So it is, in a sense, the limit, which we'll see later on, where the limit of capital associates will be the BWL. So we'll see some things start to shift there.
Don't jump ahead too far. That's a big jump. That was just a big jump, my friend. Let's stick with the Urstaat right now. A big jump.
Well, I mean, that's
it's where we're aiming. It's where we're aiming. Yes.
Because that point about the horizon, I mean, that's them setting up the limit of the despotic socius, which is going to be the Urstaat. And then the question becomes, right, if we want to look at Asiatic production, not for what it is in the account standard of Marxism, what does it do, right? It would be that one, the establishment of this limit and its condition, and two, the kind of like Brooks was saying, right? Asiatic production is where we start to see privatization of land and commodities, right? Where classes become possible as opposed to, I think it was castes in the previous um, socius. But we start to see that transformation taking place, and something's happening with the death instinct that they're just highlighting here, right? They write, this would be my last point. Let me see here. It is beneath the blows of private property, then, of commodity production, that the capitalist state witnesses its decline. Right, so we're starting to see that um, the Urstaat, at one hand, it's doing this overcoating process, right? Which is why we get like peeling back the layers of paint almost, right? The black, the Jew, the Egyptian, the Mycenaean, the Greek, right? There's like all these imbrications going on. And then on the other hand, one of the things the Urstaat and the state it produces are dealing with is going to be, I suppose, in a simple word, the death drive, right? It's encounter with that.
Oh no, let's get through the rest because now we're starting to jump towards the end of the chapter as well, and I'm let's try to keep right where we're at. Right now, we're just discussing the movement of the creation of the state, how it plays, how it works, and how it sits underneath these extra states or city states that were created, and the creation of private property that changes the creditor-debtor relation in the relation of opposed classes. I'm going to continue right to the next paragraph. Sorry to interrupt, Jack. Just that was a lot, and I want to make sure we're getting through this bit by bit because we could literally just keep diving. But I'll continue. But how does one explain both this latency into which the despotic state enters and this power with which it reforms itself on modified foundations in order to spring back more mendacious, colder, and more hypocritical than ever? This oblivion and this return. On the one hand, the ancient city-state, the Germanic commune, the feudalism presuppose the great empires and cannot be understood except in terms of the Urstaat that serves as their horizon. On the other hand, the problem confronting these forms is to reconstitute the Urstaat insofar as possible, given the requirements of their new distinct determinations. For what do private property, wealth, commodities, and classes signify? The breakdown of codes. The appearance, the surging forth of now decoded flows that pour over the socius, crossing it from one end to the other. The state can no longer be content to overcode territorial elements that are already coded. It must invent specific codes for flows that are increasingly deterritorialized, which means putting despotism in the service of the new class relations, integrating the relations of wealth and poverty, of commodity and labor, reconciling market money and money from revenues, everywhere stamping the mark of the Urstaat on the new state of things. And everywhere, the presence of the latent model that can no longer be equaled, but that one cannot help but imitate. The Egyptians' melancholy warning to the Greeks echoes through history. You Greeks will never be anything but children. You want to take a stab at this one, Jack?
Yeah, and this is exactly what I was highlighting, right? That on the one hand, the Urstaat is encountering, like a death drive, right? There's the crumbling of the state, right? Or as we say more colloquially, the crumbling of the empires, right? The from Rome today to ruins tomorrow, yeah. So you're seeing that on the one hand, but then on the other hand, you're seeing how the Urstaat actually comes with also a latency, or what they're calling an oblivion here, right? So you've got an oblivion and a return. So you're seeing how with that encounter of like the state crumbling and then returning, right? With the Urstaat and its return of the state, we get this potentiality for latency, right? So they're drawing on Freud there. I think what they're driving at here is with this latency, right? And with its relationship to something like the death drive here, overcoding no longer becomes enough, right? So it's not simply enough that where you've got this kind of layers of paint, right? Underneath the Jew, there's an Egyptian, and underneath the Greek is an Egyptian, right? It just so happens here. But I think you've got to go even further here, right? Which is to say that what the Urstaat makes possible is also not just that overcoding, but the breakdown of code. So we're starting to see more toward deterritorialization happening here, where it becomes possible now for, let me see, I guess to focus on a quote, uh, for what do private property, wealth, commodities, and classes signify? The breakdown of codes, the appearance, the surging forth of now decoded flows that pour over the socius, crossing it from one into the other. Right, so this is the great fear of the socii at this point, is the decoded flows, or more specifically, non-coded flows. And here we have the Urstaat actually kind of mingling with them. They go on, the state can no longer be content to overcode territorial elements that are already coded. It must invent specific codes for flows that are increasingly deterritorialized, which means putting despotism in the service of the new class relations. And there's a long list here, right? But what that means is the horizon, the limit of the world, the limit of the socius and its all of its potentiality, right, is going to be put into service of mitigating the decoding that it's actually causing, right? So on one hand, the Urstaat is overcoding in that. On the other hand, it's now creating deterritorialization, where we're starting to see this problem of death and latency. That now the Urstaat actually has to, and this is where the Earth kind of comes in, the Urstaat still has to deal with coding, right? And so you have those two operations that I think they're trying to highlight right here.
I have two questions. The first one being more about understanding one of the later sentences about stamping the mark of the Urstaat on the new state of things. Can I paraphrase that as like the Urstaat legitimizing deterritorialization? Is that a fair paraphrasement?
I think there's a lot of ways you can take that. My first immediate reaction would be actually that it's doing its best to become a quasi-cause, saying that it's the one doing the thing, owning it, the same way the American dollar is called the American dollar, or wherever you have the Russian ruble, the British pound, this idea that the state is the one backing it, or the state is the one doing it or owning it, that's the stamp. It's playing symbolically. Like, one of the things that they talk about a great deal is with codes and how codes are sort of controlled. There is a nature inside of the primitive and the despotic where code flows are controlled through codes, through symbolic codes. Like this symbolic organization or symbolic nature of oppression, I suppose, the creation and organization of social production through these symbols, I think, is a big deal to those sort of sides. It plays through that sort of setup of this like qualitative control around social production and the control of flows, and it feels like that's pointing in that direction, at least to me.
Yeah, then that kind of also brings me to my second question, and that is, I just simply don't completely understand, but this is, I think, also in other parts of the text, like how private property, wealth, commodities, and classes are a breakdown of codes or a deterritorialization. Because as laid out in the same paragraph, relations of wealth and poverty are codes, right?
There's a recoding that happens, but we have to think about it from think of it as the position of the state, the Urstaat, sort of sitting back and able to look through 4D time, for example, and is going back over the primitive, and the codes that are set up there are very hardcore. Like, as we talked about it in the primitive socius, shit is really rough on people. It is very particular. People are what they are. Everything is very much matched up and imminent to what's happening in, grab kind of anything. The hunters are right up against the real. The desires of what I have are coded right up against what is actually happening. The change over time that happens as the despot comes in, there is a decoding and recoding of a lot of these things as we move from not a communal property. You would never have a conversation around property. That's not a thing in the same way that Oedipus and mom and daughter or incest is not a thing inside of the primitive. Things are coded so purely that now we're recoding them. But that code of property is breaking down. Now it's private property, so it's a symbol that we use to control this or that. Well, what is exactly private property? Like, actually give me that. Well, it's these other symbols that it's reliant on. It's a chain of signification. The same is true of wealth or commodities or classes. These things are absolutely the breakdown of codes. And here's the state here trying to do its best to recode or overcode or recontrol this. The surging forth of now decoded flows that pour over the socius is the sentence that comes next. And I think that is the line here. The state can no longer be content to overcode territorial elements that are already coded. It must invent specific codes for flows that are increasingly deterritorialized, which means putting despotism in the service of the new class relations, integrating the relations of wealth and poverty. The old joke, heavy be the head that wears the crown. The king doesn't control the classes. Like, he can't one day go, excellent, no more classes. He's in service to them as much as anything else. There's a weird setup that these symbols and these rules and these codes are actually the things that are running it and controlling it. That's the recoding of things by the state.
But so when they say here in italic, the breakdown of codes, it's not necessarily the breakdown of the idea of all codes, but more the breakdown of the codes specifically that they were there before private property.
Yeah, the codes are disintegrating and being reformed into other things. But now one thing that didn't exist, which like the concept of communal property, which was just everything is kind of everyone's, but there's a lot of rules that we have to deal with imminently. Now it's like, cool, this is communal property, this is personal property, this is private property, this is public property. And here's how that kind of works, and I've got to deal with that shit. That is a breakdown, a disintegration of the clean code to 4 things, 10 things, 100 things. And then now feel free to have a conversation with literally anyone about what any of those things mean, and you're going to get a billion other answers. Because capital is a whole fucking different beast than despotism for a whole other thing. But I don't want to get into that. So this is, again, these decoded flows are now just going nuts and going wild. And the state's here basically to put these things in control. It integrates the relations of wealth and poverty, of commodity labor, reconciles market money and money from revenues everywhere, stamping its own mark on the new state of things. This is America. This is Britain. This is Rome. This is who we are. This is the setup. This is the thing. This is the state, the Urstaat.
I just find it really difficult to visualize the deterritorialized state without immediately envisioning the reterritorialization.
Well, it's because it always happens together.
Right. Okay. Yeah. So they just go together always.
Yeah. It's the line they have is deterritorialization happens with the left hand, reterritorialization with the right. Like it's
okay. Right.
They're right next to each other. You can't just have deterritorialization. It's just pure unraveling.
Okay.
Sounds to me like this is describing kind of a cycle of occurrence that happened in the ancients, between the state, private property, and these kind of debtor credit relationships that you could say that are repeated maybe throughout the history in different societies, and it's going to be back to our modern capitalism, which is you could think of it in those terms that it's it's going through a kind of a similar process, Uh,
I know I heard someone else wanting to jump in there, so I'll leave it open for a second. Was it you, Jack, wanting to jump in? Or maybe Seraph? Hmm?
yeah, I was just saying that what he's describing, like classes and private property is just exactly what our modern capitalism is like, and there is this how he describes these kind of communal relations that occurred, but then it's transformed, and you could think of it in modern terms, right?
Well,
Of
and
what's happening today.
absolutely. Well, and they're wanting, one of the big things they're doing here is they're trying to pull apart from the socius the state, because one of the great challenges, I mean, just in leftism in general, is understanding that the state isn't what does everything. Like, there's this very simple conceptual representation of power that is, oh, the state is the economy, America is all of these. It's like, look, there's pieces of all of these things that are functioning. They're the social machines that are part of this entire nightmare that we're living in. It's not just like this one thing. Like right now, our problem isn't just capital. It didn't used to just be the despot. We got this other shit. We got all these things from representation to the state, and the state itself has its own sort of machine nature, what it's pushing for, what it's trying to do, what it wants to get, how it functions, that we need to understand as part of this, because in order to have a real grasp, and to me, this is my interpretation, in order to have a real grasp of this universalist history that they're wanting to pull us back through, we can't just assume everything is one gigantic one, yes. But when we go back, we can't just assume that the economy and state and power are all part of the same mechanism. They're fucking not. They're all different bits, and here we're breaking down and separating out the bits that are part of that move as we move towards the state, as we move towards Asiatic production, and how it just so happens we still have that 6,000 fucking years later. There's this consistency. It's almost a transcendental state that is making its way through, and how it functions, and how it's made its way through early on is by seeing these decoding flows, and in that process of almost being terrified of them, doing its best to recode and cover them up.
Yeah. So you're saying that these different machines that operated then are still, in operating today. You have, capitalism, socialism, communism, and private property, and state property, and so forth. And those same machines are still, with us today, right?
Yeah, I feel like that's spot on. I know the last time, I should go back and re-listen, the first time we went through, someone knew what the quote, you Greeks will never be anything but children, we had a wonderful ramble about exactly what it meant, and it backed up what I'm saying here, but I need to go back and find it. It's worth re-listening maybe. But I'm going to continue to the next paragraph. The special situation of the state as a category, oblivion in return, has to be explained. To begin with, it should be said that the primordial despotic state is not a historical break like any other. Of all the institutions, it is perhaps the only one to appear fully armed in the brain of those who institute it. The artists with a look of bronze? That is why Marxism didn't quite know what to make of it. It has no place in the famous 5 stages: primitive, communism, city-states, feudalism, capitalism, and socialism. It is not one formation among others, nor is it the transition from one formation to another. It appears to be it appears to be set back at a remove from what it transects and from what it resects, as though it were giving evidence of another dimension, a cerebral ideality that is added to, superimposed on the material evolution of societies, a regulating idea or principle of reflection, terror, that organizes the parts and the flows into a whole. What is transected, superseded, or overcoated by the despotic state is what comes before, the territorial machine, which it reduces to the state of bricks, of working parts, henceforth subjected to the cerebral idea. In this sense, the despotic state is indeed the origin, but the origin as an abstraction that must include its differences with respect to the concrete beginning. We know that myth always expresses a passage and a divergence. The primitive territorial myth of the beginning expressed the divergence of a characteristically intense energy, what Marcel Grial called the metaphysical part of mythology, the vibratory spiral, in relation to the social system in extension that it conditioned, passing back and forth between alliance and filiation. But the imperial myth of the origin expresses something else. The divergence of this beginning from the origin itself, the divergence of the extension from the idea, of the genesis from the order and the power, the new alliance, and also what repasses from filiation to alliance, what is taken up again by filiation. Jean-Pierre Vernant shows in this way that the imperial myths are not able to conceive a law of organization that is immanent in the universe. They need to posit and internalize this difference between the origin and the beginnings, between the sovereign power and the genesis of the world. The myth constitutes itself within this distance. It makes it into the very object of its narrative, retracing the avatars of sovereignty down through the succession of generations to the moment when a supremacy, this time definitive, puts an end to the dramatic elaboration of the dynastia. So that, in the end, one no longer really knows what comes first, and whether the territorial machine does not, in fact, presuppose a despotic machine from which it extracts the bricks, or that it segments in its turn. Whew. Long paragraphs are always fun. Let's start with the part that's in italics. It is not one formation among others, nor is it the transition from one formation to another. The idea of the state being one element or one formation, or any of those things being one formation among others, or being the transformation from one to another. Instead, sitting back, given evidence of another dimension, a cerebral ideality that is added to, superimposed on the material evolution of societies, this assumed larger concept that a society needs to organize itself around. This is, I have a whole interpretation around this. I haven't seen other places. I'm going to, because I love this section. It's a big deal to me, because I think it's where we start getting really interesting. I'll leave it open. Jack, anyone else want to take a crack before I dive in for my other take?
I suppose, the big thing they're getting at in the beginning of the paragraph is that, and this is where the Jungian part is important too, right? There's a difference between the capital S state and the Urstaat, right? There's a difference between how the state functions in its territoriality as an apparatus, if you like, and the sort of archetypal element, or the Urstaat, that forms the horizon, making that state, or that altogether despised socios, right?
Completely.
Its relationship to the state.
Just real quick as an example, it's the difference between the Oedipus complex and actually having, and actually the Oedipus complex, this large idea that is, everyone has it, it's base, it's innate to all of us, or the fact that some people do have that. There's a difference between the actually functioning desiring machines being broken in that way versus this larger conception and demand and determinate command about how we should behave. That's the difference I see.
That,
No?
I think I follow. If what you're saying is that there's a difference between the limit and what the limit makes possible in the apparatus, right? Or
there's the difference between the There's a difference between the actual functioning thing and the representation we demand a thing be in the shape of.
It's less a representational issue for me because, especially because it's so interesting how it functions with the socios. But, the thing I'm getting out of it is more so that the place of the state is conditioned upon the Urstaat, right? And the way that the despotic has its reciprocation with the Urstaat includes the processes of overcoding and, in the same vein, right, a deterritorialization problem that brings back the necessity, well, that reaffirms the necessity of coding, right, which is why it's going to transect the Earth. What the Earth does as mega machine, the despotic still has to deal with, and the Urstaat seems to be part of what's going to be, since it's a limit, right? What puts that codification into process? And so, as I'm seeing it, I mean, especially with the cerebral ideality, what they're getting at is the introduction of, if you kind of take the Holland squint, right? It's the signified, right? We're moving to a mental, to an internalization problem, because of what's happened to writing and speech, how they've changed here.
Right. So to me, this section deals a lot with sort of a push towards understanding that the state, to kind of what I was trying to say earlier, that we have the state. Like, America is a country. I'm not going to say that there's no such thing as a state. Like, but there is an assumption that this is how states have to be. It's the line they open with, the special situation of the state as a category. Oblivion return has to be explained. To begin with, it should be said that primordial despotic state is not a historical break like any other. Of all the institutions, it's the only one fully armed in the brain of those who institute it. The artist with a look of bronze. This idea that the despotic is one sort of exceptional formation of the state, and that all the others are, it's different setups, or maybe it was a transition of one form of state to another. They're saying, no, there's a underlying thing that's happening here, a myth, to sort of what you were talking about with the Jungian in the setup. The myth that is being called between all of this, the first thing that happens, I think they say, is the myth of, the imperial myth of the origin expresses something else. Divergence of this beginning from the origin, the divergence of the extension from the idea of the genesis from the order and the power, the new alliance, and what repasses from filiation to alliance and what is taken up again by filiation. This idea that any state is actually a different state. It's not. They're all part of the Urstaat. This underlying demand of how we need to have society organized came about from nailed it. The despotic knew exactly how to handle it. Since then, it's been kind of crumbling and having a few issues, but it's still the state and this larger conception of the state continuing on. To continue to read towards the end there, just because I think it bolsters my point. So that in the end, one no longer really knows what comes first, and whether the territorial machine does not in fact presuppose a despotic machine from which it extracts the bricks, or that it segments in its turn. The nature of the myth of the Urstaat, this sort of unending natural organization of the production of society in a very particular way, at some point, and I think that's fair now, we don't really have the ability to say which came first, not chicken or egg, but instead primitive or despotic, because they rely upon each other in order to sort of exist. The territorial machine itself presupposes a despotic machine from which it extracts the bricks or the segments in its turn. Is it the state or is it the despotic? They come hand in hand because the state is the machine. The state is the apparatus, the assemblage through which these other things function. I said it wrong. It's not primitive, it's state. State and despotic. They kind of function next to each other very effectively. This paragraph I find brilliant. Please, if anyone else has a different take, I'd love to hear it, but the line that I think matters here, and maybe we can keep moving on so we don't get stuck on this, but the line that matters here is where it says the territorial machine, which it reduced to the state of bricks of working parts, henceforth subjective to the cerebral idea. In this sense, the despotic state is indeed the origin, but the origin as an abstraction that must include its differences with respect to the concrete beginning. We know that myth always expresses a passage and a divergence. Primitive territorial myth of a beginning expressed the divergence of a characteristically intense energy, what Grial called the metaphysical part of mythology, the vibratory spiral, the social system and extension that it conditioned passing back and forth. But the imperial myth of the origin expresses something else, a divergence of this beginning from the origin. The play there, I feel like they're making here is pushing very much towards the state as an assemblage that we don't know that we have, kind of. Maybe I'm misreading. I'd love anyone, please correct me on any of this, but it's one I've been really stuck on whenever we read this. It happened last time, and it happened about 2 months ago when I did a side reading of this. It's the imperial myth. We'll come back to it. I do want to keep reading. Does anyone object to moving on?
That's fine. Maybe we can take that up at the end, because I'm having a little bit of trouble putting it all together in my head. So maybe we can talk about it more and take that perspective and see how it fits with this section.
Yeah, we'll have a longer discussion. I think it's worth it. All right, to continue. In a certain sense, it is necessary to say as much in regard to what comes after the primal state, in regard to what is resected by this state. It supersects what comes before, but resects the formations that follow. There, too, it is like an abstraction that belongs to another dimension, always at a remove and struck by latency, but that springs back and returns stronger than before in the later forms that lend it a concrete existence. A protean state, yet there had never been but one state. Whence the variations, all the variants of the new alliance, falling nevertheless under the same category. For example, feudalism not only presupposes an abstract despotic state that it divides into segments according to the regime of its private property and the rise of its commodity production, but the latter induce in return the concrete existence of a feudal state in the proper sense of the term, where the despot returns as the absolute monarch. For it is a double error to think that the development of commodity production is enough to bring about feudalism's collapse. On the contrary, this development reinforces feudalism in many respects, offering the latter new conditions of existence and survival, and that feudalism of itself is in opposition to the state, which on the contrary, as the feudal state, is capable of preventing commodities from introducing the decoding of flows that alone would be ruinous to the system under consideration. I'll read the footnote in a moment. And in more recent examples, is this entire paragraph, is this whole page the paragraph? Am I doing it right? Because sometimes this PDF screws up.
Yes, that's correct.
Jesus.
It ends right at the top of 221 with
Of course.
in the brain, Urstaat.
All right. And in more recent examples, we have to go along with Wittfogel when he shows the degree to which modern capitalist and socialist states take on the characteristic features of the primordial despotic state. As for democracies, How could one fail to recognize in them the despot who has become colder and more hypocritical, more calculating, since he must himself count and code instead of overcoding the accounts? It is useless to compose the list of differences after the manner of conscientious historians, village communes here, industrial societies there, and so on. The differences could be determining only if the despotic state were one concrete formation amongst others, to be treated comparatively. But the despotic state is the abstraction that is realized, and imperial formations, to be sure, only as an abstraction, the overcoding immanent unity. It assumes its immanent concrete existence only in the subsequent forms that cause it to return under other guises and conditions. Being the common horizon for what comes before and what comes after, it conditions universal history only provided it is not on the outside, but always off to the side, the cold monster that represents the way in which history is in the head, in the brain, the Urstaat. To read the footnote, Maurice Daub has shown how the development of commerce, of the market, and of money had very diverse effects on feudalism, at times reinforcing serfdom and the whole array of feudal structures, studies in the development of capitalism. Francois Hincker has elaborated the concept of state feudalism to show how the French absolute monarchy, in particular, maintained the productive forces in commodity production in the framework of a feudalism that did not end until the 18th century.
And that's one thing I've always appreciated about this section is that the pains they're taking to, at least as I read it, right, feudalism itself is not a form of capitalism, which I believe does align with like a contemporary economic theory, but that is really critical, right? Because what will happen with something like mercantilism or more so like full-on capitalism that in a sense displaces the despotic, uh, altogether reconfigures the Urstaat in its full, right? It hasn't taken place yet.
Yeah, and I think a big section of this, the stuff that stands out to me here is, again, going back and saying that there is this thing sitting there on the sidelines, apparatus perhaps of sorts, that is sitting sort of haunting all of these elements off to the side, the cold monster that represents the way in which history is in the head, in the brain, the reorganization of these elements, the thing that remolds history in order to control it and to recode it and place it into these states, that is ultimately the thing sort of waiting, that is able to place us into our location from leader to subject, for example, in the class structure, or is able to sort of organize and code flows properly. There's a element that's always sitting there as it's continually the thing that's doing it. The feudal state, for example, their entire conversation here is like, just to go back, because Marx has the setup where he talks about the different states that come along, the different types of states, and they're very clear in saying no, we're step back. Like, we're actually going to be taking those on. The 5 stages, there's primitive communism, city-states, feudalism, capitalism, and socialism. Those 5 are his. It's like, no, those are, let's break them apart. There's actually underneath all of that, ever since Asiatic production hit, ever since was created, we have this weird state thing that's been hanging out and is part of how we organize all of production, and it really hasn't left. You could say it's almost an Oedipus of society, if you want to regard society as one large collection of its own desiring machines, perhaps. And that I feel that's towards their critique here as they're talking about this, that The despotic state is the abstraction that is realized in imperial formations, to be sure, only as an abstraction. It assumes its imminent concrete existence only in the subsequent forms that cause it to return under other guises and conditions. It's sitting there waiting, finding other ways to pop up, to sit. Rocket Test in the chat is talking about. So capitalism supposedly started in the 16th century. French monarchy kept feudalism in its raw form to the 18th. When capitalism started as a thing, like there isn't a day, and it's a series of parts to what we know today and what capitalism will be 10 years from now or 100 years from now will be different. Hopefully fucking gone, but hey, let's figure out. Maybe, who knows? The parts of what make capitalism are kind of where we start getting into in a bit. But the idea of the state is something that has been around. There's no series of states. It is one state that we've basically been living under since forever. It's Questions, comments on that paragraph?
But it's all about what made possible, right? What makes this category possible?
Questions, thoughts, anyone else? All right. I will continue. Marx recognized that there was indeed a way in which history proceeded from the abstract to the concrete. Quote, "The simple categories are the expression of relations within which the less developed concrete may have already realized itself before having posited the more many-sided connection or relation which is mentally expressed in the more concrete category, while the more developed concrete preserves the same category as the subordinate relation." End quote. The state was first this abstract unity that integrated sub-aggregates functioning separately. It is now subordinated to a field of forces whose flows it coordinates and whose autonomous relations of domination and subordination it expresses. It is no longer content to overcode maintained and imbricated territorialities. It must invent codes for the decoded flows of money, commodities, and private property. It no longer of itself forms a ruling class or classes. It is itself formed by these classes, which have become independent and delegate it to serve their power and their contradictions, their struggles and their compromises with the dominated classes. It is no longer the transcendent law that governs fragments. It must fashion as best it can a whole to which it will render its law immanent. It is no longer the pure signifier that regulates its signifieds. It now appears behind them, depending on the things it signifies. It no longer produces an overcoding unity. It is itself produced inside the field of decoded flows. As a machine, it no longer determines a social system. It is itself determined by the social system into which it is incorporated in the exercise of its functions. In brief, it does not cease being artificial, but it becomes concrete. It tends to concretization, while subordinating itself to the dominant forces. The existence of an analogous evolution has been demonstrated for the technical machine, when it ceases to be an abstract unity or intellectual system reigning over separate subaggregates to become a relation that is subordinated to a field of forces operating as a concrete physical system. began as an idea, a way to organize and handle the production underneath it of multiple disparate conglomerations of people, and over time hardened, concretized, became the thing, the shape, the necessity that even the machines no longer being under its control now utilize it to manage the flows and the coding overall. It's no longer content to overcode maintained and imbricated territorialities and must invent codes for the decoded flows of money, commodities, and private properties. It no longer of itself forms a ruling class or classes. It is itself formed by these classes, which have become independent and delegate it to serve their power in contradictions, struggles, and compromises with the dominated classes. I love this section. Sorry, my brain's going places. Does anyone have questions on this? This is obviously going through here, talking through Marx and the nature in which the concretization of the state has happened, how it moved through time, how it went from the core idea, concept, all the way through to the actual physical systems that we know today, or than we knew back then, the form of such things. As a machine, it no longer determines a social system. It is determined by the social system into which it is incorporated in the exercise of its functions. Again, and maybe I don't need to explain it a second time, but I just really like that phrasing. JK, please.
Yeah, it was, I think he just basically saying that the state originally was an abstract idea to regulate and integrate the flows of money and power, free trade and so forth. But then it became a tool by the people with power, with more surplus value, with the ability to control these flows. And you have, for instance, lobbyists in Washington paying off politicians, in the pockets of these corporations, and pretty much controlling what the state policies are regarding how money flows, right? And basically, that's our situation today, where you have one party that's totally in the pockets of the corporations, and they're just paying them off, and they're even in the Supreme Court, and they're the state is now controlled by the dominant classes.
And it's the line in there. It's no longer the transcendent law that governs fragments. It must fashion as best it can a whole to which it will render its law immanent. The shift is from, as we talked about earlier, the moments of, hey, what does that say? Who's the emperor? Who's ruling over you? I don't know. It turned out they may be dead. Like they might be dead. We're on to the next one. It doesn't matter. I still do what I'm told. That setup is something that has, again, matured over time and changed to now where we don't really have such edicts or rules or setups that we need to obey, and we kind of just do as we're told. Instead, the state has worked to make its laws and its reality immanent to us, where we actually we need to, we'll be getting into how capital does this and plays with debt and plays with these elements again. But the way that the primitive work that was so very, very effective was making the desires of what we did imminent. It did it generally through terror, through fear, through pain, through these other elements. A lot of awful shit. If you want to go read some of the formations. But over time, as that became a different setup, suddenly it's on high. We're getting orders. The state needed to move away, and did move away, from literally having this transcendent law that governs fragments to instead creating a whole that itself governed and made the laws and the rules of this whole immanent to the experience of all the different pieces. It's such an amazingly powerful thing to say. I keep equating it back to Oedipus, because the way Oedipus functions, as an example, is through a paralogism that doesn't do something drastically different than that, but make the way that it functions immanent and deforms us. The nature of how it's talking about here, and the shift here from this pure signifier that regulates signifieds, instead now appearing behind them, depending on the things that is signified in its place. There's a lot to be said there for how that shift has happened over time. The idea essentially moving to the backdrop as the machinery that it forms slowly becoming so powerful that the people who were effectively ruled by it are so ingrained within it that they continue to keep it moving. Once upon a time, the state owned and ruled over all the classes. This wasn't like some classes were, no, they absolutely were ruled over by the state. Over time, the shift kind of put them in a position of power, and rather than, eliminate the state, instead they basically utilize it to delegate their power. And as such, the state, now concretized, moves to the background and sort of smiles as this mass of people, this subjected group, keep it alive and keep the parts moving as it kind of just sits there and keeps an eye on shit. The concretized form of it. It's a really incredible thing. That's how I read it. Jack? Is that making sense?
I guess I would have to pose a criticism to what JK's proposed, which is that I think we risk going a little bit too far into, if not intentionality, then a little bit too deep into consciousness, which is kind of coming into play here, where we're seeing terror and reflection starting to intertwine, as well as the abstract in that. So we are seeing some of that, where we start getting problems like intention and some of the more classical problems in classical philosophy, right? So I guess I would pose that here, with questions of intentionality in that, right? We're still trying to understand what would make it possible, what conditions, what starts to put together the configurations for intentionality, right, as it will be produced, right, among other things, right, which is where they're getting at with the signification, right. The Urstaat is less a question of, I think obviously it's a less question of signifier and signified, as opposed to a question of how it affects signification, especially as we've moved into the so-called head, so-called brain, right? The way that, particularly with the despotic in that, right? We're looking at how the new alliances, insofar as we're going to deal with representation in that, we're looking at how the new alliances and the extended affiliations are going to be contingent for the constitution of any intentionality, any reflection that's going to be possible here, right? Before it even gets taken at a conscious level and somebody runs with it. I don't know if they had banks back then,
but this is why I think it's fair to equate it to something like Oedipus. Oedipus, my dad never yelled at me and said, you need to be Oedipalized. I never went to a psychoanalyst and had it happen. It's a thing that happened by just existing how we exist today. We have man, woman, child, and the way things and representations are formed. It's not so much that Oedipus is wanting it to happen, but Oedipus has effectively been concretized the same way in the unconscious, where it kind of hangs back, the forms it takes and the people around it and my desires play into it enough to continue to manufacture the parts of it that it needs and to continue the machine work inside my head. In the same way, it's here is the state sitting and waiting, and there's the different ruling classes or the different social machines, desiring machines being the sort of molecular equivalent of such a thing, that allow this to be essentially a mirror of that. The state being this large-scale representation that over time becomes concretized, but itself the idea sitting in the backdrop, now utilized by the social machines to continue to produce. It doesn't need necessarily an intentionality, because there is always a movement in a direction, thanks to the nature of desire and desire pathways and flows. So to me, this is more of that allegory of, we're talking about on the one side the molecular, the other side the molar. The rules kind of apply to both. There's not a lot where it's like there's a direction to both that sort of push towards the subject in a lot of ways. But this is examples of how that happens and the directions that they push back, and how the society pushes Oedipalization and representation down in, but subjects utilizing their Oedipalization pushing upwards create the state. And the state exists as much real as Oedipus does.
I guess I would say if we want to work in Oedipus, I mean, like 216, 215, 217, where they're going into some of the things Oedipus does during the despotic. I think we would need that, right? Because there's a way in which we have to take the pains to work out the Urstaat's relationship to Oedipus. And for me, I focused more, following Deleuze and Guattari here, on the new alliance and the extended filiation, which is critical for how Oedipus is going to function. They haven't exactly, and in this section, they're not going to really hack at Oedipus here. So we'd have to do some work, I think, to connect how Oedipus and the Urstaat commingle.
I'm not saying they necessarily commingle, but maybe I'm making my point poorly. More or less, I'm talking about the nature of the state, utilizing the social machines to organize in a very specific way until they're effectively hardened and unchanging and concretized, and then stepping back and allowing the social machines that are a part of it, which includes subjects, the different classes, different people with different preconscious desires, to continue to create it and give itself a place. As it says, it how do they phrase it? Ceases to be an abstract unity or intellectual system reigning over subaggregates, to become a relation that is subordinated to a field of forces operating as a concrete physical system. The idea made real through repetition of the apparatus that it is a part of. And that is literally the same thing as how, and like that is how Oedipus works within the unconscious. Like the entire chapter 2 is essentially that critique, and the way that production of desire and desire production functions in that same way over time, hardened towards representations then fuck with further representations and move things into very specific plates and concretize them until we believe that we exist. Lo and behold, the state exists. I don't think it's a wild thing to say that there's some kind of relationship or mirror image of that across the subject divide between molar and molecular. Well, let's keep going. With one paragraph left, and then we can finish discussing. So let me just punch. Please.
Ask a question about that statement at the end of that one paragraph, where it says, "You Greeks will never be anything but children." Are they? Is he kind of making a sarcastic remark about the Greeks who thought that they could establish this kind of democracy that in which everything is going to be fair and continue on the same way? Or it was so they were kind of naive about think of that, then when in fact this is the kind of process that's already at work in that society where where the state was going to be maybe taken over by the opposing by the classes that are, and then the dominant classes will will be in control, right?
It it's not exactly sarcastic, um, though it does kind of slap you in the face. I think they're sincere when they quote the word warning because how
Right.
I read that is the Greeks don't realize that they're doing as the Egyptians do and did, right? And
Sure.
yet at the same time, they believe, just like the Egyptians would, that they are doing something sort of new and that they've made a break, right? Which is your despotic, and that's the historical break in that. The Greeks, like anything else here, right? The Jews, the Mycenaeans, the Phoenicians, and that they pointed out because of the process of overcoding and that. The deterritorialization and the recoding, the reterritorialization processes are not exactly lost on them, but at the same time, the way that it reconstitutes them, as opposed to a complete, absolute, change, like right, like historic history would be just cut off there, and all of a sudden everything starts afresh. Just like they're saying, Deleuze and Guattari is saying with, with the imperial, with the barbarian socius and that, you have the problem of a beginning taking over from an origin, or the beginning of the despotic socius. Um, and that's kind of what the Grial myth and that is getting at, I think, where that beginning seems to supersede an origin. So, like, even if you think of like the theogony and the way that the Olympians um, take over from the Titans, right? And you've got the Titanomachia and the war against the Titans. In the same way, right? It's tempting to just say, right, they've become the Titans. But at the same time, they are doing different things. But what they miss is the continuity of the socius and the way that the two operations of deterritorialization and overcoding, right, which implies the coding processes of the earth and that is being, on one hand, right, it's in progress, it's being used and all of that, but on the other hand, it's being kind of almost taken for granted.
It's the line very. I don't think I'm disagreeing with you, Jack. I didn't fully follow a lot of what you said. I'm sorry, because there's a lot that said there. I'm still processing, but the line specifically is the Egyptians mocking the Greeks that they don't have 1,000-year-old traditions, that the things that they're doing and the way they're going about it, they will not have forward-moving sort of continuity. As you said, the continuity of socius or the continuity of state or whatever it may be. It's the way that the Urstaat needing to continually reinvent itself based on, whatever's happening or decoded flows, as such, creates these breaks, the oblivion in return, the shifting of meaning, the symbolic meaning. And that line between the priest and Solon is intended to be the Egyptians mocking the Greeks for that. Because the Egyptians have this one long, giant story that they all know, and they have traditions and all of that, and the Greeks comparatively didn't.
Right. And so the Greeks, democracy and so forth, gave way to the Roman Empire, and so it really basically it comes down to a shifting of power, right, from one, maybe dynasty to another, and it's like a cycle. I think of the dynasties in China, shifting from one to another. It's just you know, it looks like a repetition of a similar cycle.
And I think you're on the right track there. I don't think it's about the shifting of power in that. If we go back to the usage of the first principles of paranoiac knowledge, right, the process of deterritorialization in that, which is kind of what you're getting at with your circle. That's where I think especially where they, um, in what they're quoting, that could be a mockery. But Deleuze and Guattari also considered a warning, right? Which is that in this process of establishing a new alliance one only reaffirms the first principles of paranoia knowledge that make um, that make the former new alliance and the continuation of a new alliance possible, right? So with your circularity, with your cyclicality there, with your process, there's a question of how it's operating, right? And one of the critical ways it's operating is through this first principle of paranoid knowledge that is providing a continuity through the Urstaat, right? At a higher, well, I should say higher, at a more, shall we say, uh, shall we say, perhaps refined level that is making all of this possible and working on the instantiations that will follow. So with the Greeks and the Egyptians, in either case, you've got the empire, you've got the democracy, you've got all these different configurations that happen throughout their histories, right? Greece goes from empire to democracy. Egypt has its own um, mainstays as far as state organizations go. But in that there are state organizations, the Urstaat is implicated here. And I think that's what's lost on the Greeks, as much as it was probably lost on the Egyptians, is that in the nice part, right, the first principle of paranoid knowledge does suggest that you are making a complete break and that things are radically changing. However, it's a reconfiguration of the Urstaat through the principles of latency and I think it was latency and overcoding, I think it was how they said it in the first paragraph.
Yes, I believe so.
Sorry, Oblivion and the Return. That's what it was. That's where you're getting your cyclicality from, the Oblivion and the Return. Right, there is that consistency.
And just to jump in, the story is actually from Platonic dialogue, story Plato's telling between Solon and an Egyptian priest. Solon visits in Egypt, and they asked him, "Oh, please tell us about blah blah blah, the history." And the quote is, just to read straight away, he made the discovery that neither he, Solon, or any other Hellene knew anything worth mentioning about times of old. On one occasion, wishing to draw them on to speak of antiquity, he began to tell about the most ancient things in our part of the world, the Phoroneus, who is called the first man, and about Niobe, and after the deluge, and the survival of Deucalion and Pyrrha. And he traced the genealogy of their descendants, and reckoning up the dates, tried to compute how many years ago the events of which he was speaking happened. Thereupon one of the priests, who was of a very great age, said, "O Solon, Solon, you Hellenes are never anything but children. There is not an old man among you." Solon asked him what he meant. "I mean to say that in mind you are all young. There is no old opinion handed down among you by ancient tradition, nor any science which is hoary with age." Just to sort of expand on that, because it just follows what Jack was saying. I believe it does. Jack, does it?
Yeah, I mean they're right. So you have this fascination at one point in history with trying to find a unified religion in a sense, right? It's kind of the same thing here with the state, where you have all these different instantiations of the state as a category, which is made possible by the Urstaat insofar as it has these processes of oblivion and return. So right, it's breaking down and countering the deterritorializations of that it's actually made possible in a certain sense. And at the same time, it's dealing with the overcodings and codings that it now has to invent, excuse me. And so, right, the nice thing about that Platonic illustration is in a sense, it is wry, right? That is like a slap in the face in a certain manner of speaking. But at the same time, it does make a point that what Solon is talking about um, is in a sense different from what's going on in Egypt and what they have there, but in another sense is kind of the same process of its formation, right? Because it's working through the same category. It's working through this the Urstaat, which is going to instantiate just like we saw, right, from this ancestor to that, right? First we had an empire, and now we've got democracy, and democracy's not working out, so we're going to try an oligarchy, right? Those different movements, just like they happen differently in Egypt, what's consistent there is going to be the Urstaat. And as I'm pointing out here, I'm highlighting the first principles of paranoid knowledge, or the way deterritorialization and reterritorialization is actually taking place in relation to that category of the state.
Before anyone says anything else, I'm going to read the last paragraph so we can at least then ramble for the next half hour if we like. But isn't this tendency to concretization in the social or technical machine precisely the movement of desire? Again and again we come upon the monstrous paradox. The state is desire that passes from the head of the despot to the hearts of his subjects, and from the intellectual law to the entire physical system that disengages or liberates itself from the law. A state desire, the most fantastic machine for repression, is still desire. The subject that desires and the object of desire. Desire, such is the operation that consists in always stamping the mark of the primordial Urstaat on the new state of things, rendering it immanent to the new system insofar as possible, making it interior to the system. As for the rest, it will be a question of starting again from zero, the founding of a spiritual empire there, where forms exist under which the state can no longer function as such in a physical system. When the Christians took possession of the empire, this complementary duality reappeared between those who wanted to do everything possible to reconstruct the Urstaat from the elements they found in the immanence of the objective Roman world, and the purists, who wanted a fresh start in the wilderness, a new beginning for a new alliance, a rediscovery of the Egyptian and Syriac inspiration that would provide the impetus for a transcendent Urstaat. What strange machines those were that cropped up on the columns and tree trunks. In this sense, Christianity was able to develop a whole set of paranoiac and celibate machines, a whole string of paranoiacs and perverts who also form part of our history's horizon and people our calendar. These are two aspects of a becoming of the state, its internalization in a field of increasingly decoded social forces, forming a physical system, its spiritualization in a supra-terrestrial field that increasingly overcodes, forming a metaphysical system. The infinite debt must become internalized at the same time as it becomes spiritualized. The hour of bad conscience draws nigh. It will also be the hour of the greatest cynicism, that repressed cruelty of the animal man made inward and scared back into himself, the creature imprisoned in the state so as to be tamed. To read the last footnote of this, which I'm going to do very quickly, which is a footnote that covered the ones that people are calendar. In this regard, Jacques Lasserre has called attention to the figures and the moments of Christian asceticism, Egypt, Palestine, and Syria, starting with the 3rd century. First come gentle paranoiacs who install themselves close to a village, then withdraw into the desert, where they invent astonishing ascetic machines, expressing their struggle against the old alliances and filiations, the St. Anthony stage. Next, communities of disciples are formed, with a military discipline where the monk reconstructs around him in the forms of ascetic and collective constraints, the aggressive universe of the old persecutions, or the St. Pachomius stage. And finally, the return to the city of the village, armed groups of perverts who assign themselves the task of struggling against the dying paganism, the Schnaudi stage. More generally, concerning the monastery's relationship with the city, see Lewis Mumford, who talks about an elaboration of a new form of urban structuration in terms of monasteries. That's the end of the footnote. Comments, notes on the last paragraph, and then we can dive into the larger thing. I'll open up. The first half of this, because there's a second half as well that pushes towards Christianity as an example. But the opening here to talk about the movement of desire, the concretization of social or technical machines, to go back a few steps to when J.K. brought up intentionality or the way the state wants to be or things like that. It seems they're saying something very similar, perhaps not directly with intentionality as though it were conscious, but it's, again, to talk about the movement of desire, the pressures, the way things push. Very much they say here, the state is desire that passes from the head of the despot to the hearts of his subjects, the intellectual law to the entire physical system that disengages or liberates itself from the law. A state desire, the most fantastic machine for repression, is still desire, the subject that desires and the object of desire. Desire is real.
Right. Right. And then it does get an intention in that, but the move I see there is that by reaffirming that this is a question of desire, right? They're taking it out of a rational question, right? Where this is like, why do people intend? I guess in a nutshell, why do people intend despotism? Here, it's more how does desire function to produce, well, in its production and its producing of despotism, right? So on one hand, the unconscious doesn't produce, the paralogisms, and right, the paralogisms act back on the unconscious and affect production. But yes, I agree with you. It does move it back into, or it does remind us that even though we're dealing with the abstract, the mind or the heart, but more especially the mind and the abstract and signification, it is still a problem and question of desire.
Well, it makes me wonder, again, when we talk about the functioning or the actual functioning of this, and why I keep going back to Oedipus as an allegory, sort of a mirrored anti-allegory, or that the state is an anti-Oedipus. This idea of desire pushing down from the very top of the molar. Like in that direction, the desire passing from the head of the despot to the hearts of his subjects. That conception of the molar, and then opposite that, saying desire moves from the organs of the subject to the head of the subject, effectively. And in between is where we have this wonderful, interesting sort of clash. It feels as though they're playing towards sort of, I don't know, are they playing? There's a scene in Dragon Ball that always happens. He's got his big giant fucking laser, and then whatever enemy has the opposite color, and they're mashing at each other, and then it's just about which one is stronger. Is this like that it's desire one direction and then the other, and whichever manipulates the best or utilizes the best comes out the other side, and where those things collapse? I'm making a meme about this later. Where those collapse, that's subjectivity and how we actually act in society. I'm memeing that. That's going to have to be a fucking picture.
I mean, that's like all of Dragon Ball Z, right? Is it's always who has the bigger Saiyan blast or the larger Saiyan hair, right? Not to make it Freudian, but yeah, I think it's even more consistent than that, though. If there is any counter positioning, right? If there is any, because we do still have the Braits, right? We still have, the move, the oblivion and the return. But I think in all of that, right, you have an intellectual desire as much as you have an emotional desire, which breaks down the traditional, the idea that anything happening in the head would be like rational, right? And then there's, like an irrational component that kind of is more emotional, or that's, in some of the more the basic conceptions of classical philosophy, right? That the head has to govern the heart, right? That kind of thing. That all kind of, I think, breaks down here, where I think the heart would be as capable of rational thought here as the intellect, the mind of the despot, if you like, even is capable of and actually produces desires, right?
please, questions, comments. I mean, there has to be one question. If not, that's fine. I'm more than happy to allow this to sort of close out. Anyone, I'm open.
So is he saying that the common to all these different kinds of, social systems, hierarchical systems, it's basically comes down to the despotic state, right? State of desire.
I think the argument would be made that in the same way that a lot of stuff within society can come back to, I'm going to keep coming back to Oedipus as my example for this. Deleuze and Guattari would never say that everything comes back to Oedipus, that Oedipus does things, or Oedipus is a construct. Oedipus is a series of parts, a lot of them, granted. The state, similarly, isn't like a thing that exists. It's a representation or an assemblage that does stuff with a shitload of very complex interrelated parts. I think their argument here in this section at a top level is saying that in a similar way to how Oedipus that sort of has sat behind and parts of it have organized over time, that we have this underlying Oedipus, not the one we know today, but this underlying piece that's kind of haunting and now coming to fruition. Very early on, there was almost this opposite thing happening at the social level, where there was a creation of this thing called the state that again, early an idea that was able to sort of get some people to organize together. As that idea hardened over time and concretized, now it's assumed to be the base nature of everything. And it's not the same exact state. It's not identical to that. The despotic state was kind of a state par excellence because it put the state in a position of absolute and total power and control in a very different way, imminently with the controls of the despot. As they say, the state desire is that of the despot's desire goes to those underneath him. In the same way, this pushes towards that. So it's the pieces of the state started then. Underlying all of it has been this thing that's been haunting, and now we've gotten to the point where we're at with capital. But underneath it all are all the pieces of this of this total state, this totalizing state that is continuous. I think does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah, so the just like Oedipus is a product of the social order, which is this despotic state of desire. Oedipus, is you know somehow becomes part of that, right? And he himself becomes a despot and realizes the kind of yeah, but the despotic state continues even after his fall. But yeah. So throughout all these different changes of different types of social systems, there is a kind of the primary flow or structure is a kind of this despotic state, right? With its desires that codes everything.
Two things there. Oedipus comes with the primitive, right? To your question, like how does Oedipus kind of get here? It comes with the primitive, right? But it changes, right? In the primitive, we have different we have a different configuration of representation and its repression, right? We've got, for instance, the aunt and the uncle are implicated, whereas with the despotic, I think we're starting to kind of shift away from that, though we're not quite at the nuclear family yet either. It'll be more like, I think, the question of the despot's family, or the family that's implicated in that, right? Because we have to deal with the Urstaat here. As to the second one, or as to the second point, insofar as we're talking about the despotic socius, yes, we are talking about despotic configuration. Yes, you made it. See, that's what I mean, though. It's always who has the bigger blast. Anyways, or the bigger hair. Insofar as we're talking about the socius, yes, we're talking about different configurations of the state that the Urstaat makes possible. But that will be different from the way the primitive engages, borrow your term, social formations, right? And the way that capital, especially in its relationship to the Urstaat, how social formations will be possible there.
Yeah, I like that.
So the Urstaat is the model. He says the primordial model. For these, it's the eternal model of everything the state wants to be and desires. So it's the eternal model for all these different forms of society, different forms, different kinds of states. You know, democracies, even capitalism, feudalism, and so forth. The Urstaat is the model for all these different types of states, right?
It does feel like it, that it is the concretized form of the different forms of socius and the instantiations of it. And in the same sense, there's no set state that has ever been the despot, or we don't live in capital land, I guess, like obviously. So there's these instantiations, and as they take place, in the same way that no one is Oedipal, everyone is Jack or Brooks or JK or Misha. Like, we have the names and we have the setup and the way that it's organized and what we call it. And this is the concretized version of, or the way that these things sort of get organized as a continuous process of essentially subordination.
I guess I'd say yes, with one caveat, which is that the primitive didn't necessarily have these kind of state configurations, although, as they point out here, there's a caveat to my caveat, which is that since the Urstaat is the point of departure and the horizon, right, it's a mutually constituting limit for this break and its instantiation, and later it's going to be swept up in the next break, right? It seems like it's very difficult to work out things in the primitive without at the same time having to deal with at least trying to bracket out the despotic, right?
But just like you said, Oedipus was started out as a primitive, right? But his destiny was to become, who he was fated to be, right? So he eventually, participates in that social order, the symbolic order of the state, and um, lives out his destiny.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. Certainly, the Oedipus is augmented in the despotic, right? It takes on and this is in part because of the way that the alliances and affiliations are, that one make Oedipus possible in the primitive, and the way that non-coded flows will also make Oedipus possible. And the way that that carries over into despotic and actually augments it, where Oedipus begins to actually develop, right? I think they even call it like a germ, right? You almost have this imagery of Oedipus as a germ, um, you know, reproducing, right? But also kind of like a delta variant, if you like, or the way that a disease today becomes like a more than a disease tomorrow, perhaps a virus, if you like.
Oh, Roger, Baroon. Roger, Baroon. We're talking about the Urstaat.
Hi guys, I don't have much time, but I just came in to listen to you guys.
So here's a question then, since you two, since we got you here. Thought, Urstaat as a concept is operates on the molar to work against and control and moderate the desire of the, as they say, the despot, or the desire that's real on the molar side, in the same sort of way that we're talking about Oedipus doing so on the molecular side. The instantiations of Oedipus may change over time, parts and pieces. We now have one ridiculous form of it, but it's become concretized. Jan? Roger?
Wait, this is too fast for me. You know, you need to like slowly get me in.
All right.
And that's the thing. It's for questions like this. You know, the Urstaat would be the original form of the state, like the essence of it, or like the germ, or whatever, like the seed that is behind it. And that's the idea that has always been there, and the potential. And then, you know, it's being actualized. The way you formulate the question, I'm just gonna re-question the question. In the sense that you're asking if the Urstaat is limiting the power of the sovereign in the same way that Oedipus would be inferring on desire.
Not limiting power, just modifying desire and playing with representation in the same way at the molar level that the Oedipal does for the molecular.
I guess if we go back to the Spinoza's starting point of, you know, original chaos, like everything is one and the same, and that it starts to be differentiating, the Urstaat as this abstract machine that is already acting as an idea on the actualization of desire, if we put it back into the context of this specific book, would probably act in the same way. But, you know, there's a progression, because, you know, it's a linear timeline, and Oedipus actually came after the idea of the Urstaat. It's already there in the potential, but, you know, the way it entered the arrangement or the assemblage, it was a bit later through agriculture, sedentarization, and everything.
Oedipus operates inside of the molecular as a representational idea that over times has become significantly concretized, especially in how not only our unconscious behaves, but how we act, how we treat, how we work with desires, the way that it creates anti-production within us, and the way that allows production to flow. It organizes production and forces us towards a handful of sort of significantly hierarchically based power coordinations inside of the triangulation. Conversely, we have the state, which over time has, you know, ultimately had its idea and may have gone in and out of vogue at different points, but ultimately utilizes the same underlying assemblage with pieces that have been broken and picked up over time as it concretizes and pushes us towards being triangulated in a very particular way in organizing not desiring machines, but social machines, people, towards very specific goals and ultimately having, as Oedipus does, being served by the thing that it once controlled. Am I far off? I feel like there's a direct allegory here between the molar and molecular and how the Urstaat operates. Maybe I'm way off. It's couldn't help getting that, especially as we read that last paragraph seems to say it pretty clearly to me, as it talks about how desire of the despot is real desire, desire of the state is real desire, and how the state is what regulates that and all of that. As they get into the example of the Christians taking possession of the empire, the debt becoming internalized, how it operates, the internalization in a field of increasingly decoded social forces forming a physical system, its spiritualization in a supraterrestrial field that increasingly overcodes forming a metaphysical system. That's feels towards that, at least. Maybe I'm way off. Who knows? Good to have you guys here regardless.
Yeah, but to make this separation between the Urstaat and Oedipus, and Jake just said, I think the question is, does the Urstaat fit the molar and Oedipus the molecular? The moment there's a state, there's already a molar there, and Oedipus, in the way it structures social relations within the family and within society, it's just not acting at the molecular level, but at the molar level as well, in the same way that the state would organize both levels, because they're always in tension together, co-producing one another.
Right, but that's to say another way, and not being cheeky when I say this, because it sounds like I am. The state is in the same way that it's not a mirror, but matter and antimatter is an opposition pointing towards a thing. Oedipus and an anti-Oedipus state that pushes the opposite direction, that organizes in a very different direction, but ultimately are complementary in the way that the Oedipus, through the way it manipulates desire and controls, ultimately does have impingement upon social machines. And I'm not saying it's like a direct one-line crossover, but the actions it takes, very much Oedipus is in favor of and helps organize towards the state. Conversely, the state, by doing what it's doing and utilizing class and private property and other elements, is helping Oedipus and pushing the other direction. And as it goes down, by impinging upon the molecular in the way that the state does, it's actually doing its part. And also the co-creation sort of Oedipus. They seem to be feeding each other in part, sort of across the midpoint, if you will, between the molar and molecular.
I think I'm with you that they work together, because they're both contingent upon Oedipus comes in the primitive, right? But they're both contingent upon the new alliance and extended affiliation. I think the trick is that because they're both caught up in representation and especially with Oedipus, more directly with repression, although it's different than capitalist socius, as we always have to clarify. I think the trick is that they both operate on the molar and molecular, so that you don't have necessarily a force and a counter force, but you actually have both the Urstaat and Oedipus working with that kind of grid work of the new alliance and the extended affiliation, so that they would be both affecting the molar and the molecular with each other, which is why, like I said earlier, I think you raise a good question. What is, and this is worth diving into, right? How do the Urstaat and Oedipus commingle? How do they work together in that, right? Where do they not perhaps align directly? Like you were saying, it's not always clean cut, I'm sure. But I think that probably would be interesting to explore, is more directly how they work to affect both the molecular and the molar.
I don't know if it's normal that your text keeps switching. I'm trying to read to know exactly where you are and where the question stems from, but it keeps switching from page to page.
That is the only way to read Anti-Oedipus.
All right, I'm gonna become schizophrenic and understand everything. But I think if you go back to, from the little bits that I can read for the little seconds, when they talk about the Christians,
you can try again.
actually...
It's because I had another PDF open and it was doing both of them switching for some reason. I don't know why.
Oh, okay. So when they say here at the end of the 221 page, stamping the mark of the primordial Urstaat on the new state of things, rendering it immanent to the new system insofar as possible, making it interior to the system. So basically, if you're taking the concept of assemblage or arrangement, the moment, the arrangement is something that prints itself, it codes in a certain manner, and the moment you enter this arrangement, you start being a part of this whole of relations. So you have the Urstaat, and then the abstract machine that is Oedipus, which organizes social relationships and taboos and everything, can be joined together into working together. If it was another type of society, it would have been another form of organization than Oedipus, as this abstract machine that creates the boundaries and creates the relation between people in society.
But the Oedipus you're talking about is specifically the capitalist socius, because Oedipus as a thing doesn't just sit there and is the thing that is, or is it, have I been misreading this? Like Oedipus is the thing that is always underneath us.
But the thing is that it only exists because it's immanent to social relationships. Social relationships are being organized because of it, and they reproduce it into an ideal form.
Right. And so over time, especially let's say during the primitive and despotic, Oedipus produced in different ways, not the one that we know. And it certainly wasn't the thing that sort of drove social production in the same way we know now. One of the things they're discussing with the Urstaat is that the state at some point becomes produced through the nature of some guy wanders near a series of villages, says, hey, I'm your god, believe in me. Yes, we'll believe in you. See, yay, I now have Asiatic production. I control what they do. We control each other. There you go. The one city's being sort of ordered from on high. There is absolutely, to me, it feels like an allegory there between that and the way representation functions to the subject and to desiring machines, the singular idea that now organizes production, that organizes desires of the subjects, that is now happening in a different regime. As such, this instantiation of the state at this moment, this first time that we had it, perhaps maybe Oedipus is the wrong one. Perhaps I should be going back even further and talking about even the creation of the subject as a concept, and that the I or the ego as a thing exists, which becomes the single godhead or the quasi-cause for desires underneath me. In that same way, the state has been produced long ago, shifted over time, concretized, and now basically sits in the background as the machines and parts it's made are utilized by the subjects underneath which it controls. That element, as it's produced over time, it feels like there is a great deal of allegory between it, or maybe like an anti-mirror version, and the way that Oedipus over time sort of has grown and controls my desires as a subject within me. Again, different regimes, different setups, but it feels the same. It was like Oedipus organizes me. Yes, through me, I organize society. Oedipus effectively organizes society, but we're talking about like the production of the society I live in through the subject, through Oedipalization of the subject. This process as desire gets matured out, and I'm spewing out Oedipus desires everywhere. Conversely, pushing down on me is the larger social machines that are organized in various different ways, yes, organized via that Oedipalization, but now we also have the state as this other element that's pushing down, and it doesn't directly do so. Instead, it utilizes class, which it invented at one point, and lo and behold, subjects went, hey, this fucking class thing's great, I'm going to keep it around, and is pushing kind of downwards at a different type of repression, but ultimately in service of continuing the same sort of lie, this idea of ideas of representation and how representations produce things to us that are non-immanent yet still ultimately control us. Or maybe I'm just spewing nonsense.
No, because it's a loopy understanding of development, because it's not like just one thing that produced the other. It's one thing that produced another thing that produces another thing that reproduces and co-produces the stuff that produced them at the beginning. So it's always something that loops back into like this feedback system that keeps going. So that's why it's difficult to explain.
Yeah, I mean, this is in 1,000 Blood Cells, they call this the reciprocal presupposition, right, between the plane of immanence and the virtual. And this. So it's. I mean, a simple way to think about it is just they're reworking the law of causality to one, account for contingency, and also allow for creativity at the same time, right? So. In this sense, right, we create the world, but the world creates us in the same time. That's sort of a simplification of the logic that's occurring. And this appears all the way back in Difference and Repetition, right, with chapter 4, the use of differential calculus. It's only through reciprocal determination that we come to find the meaning of differential y and differential x.
I was following till that last bit and totally agreeing with you. I'll have to go back and re-listen to that last bit.
Well, yeah, it's pretty much... It's because Deleuze's reading of calculus is weird, right? Because he takes some influence from the modern developments in mathematics, such as René Thom, but he's also like a big believer in Leibniz's system of sticking to the infinitesimal points of the differential equation. So, when you have a curved line, the way to find a curved line is if you put 2 points together in the line, you make it into a reciprocal fraction, then you can finally find the value of a slope of a curved line.
Well, he plays a lot with that. Again, not someone who's a math guy. Logic Ascents, he has a lot of these as he moves towards singularities and is playing with the same type of thing as well. He makes some references towards that. I haven't read The Fold in a long time, but I remember it from that as well.
Yeah. And that's one of the points when you're like trying to switch from Deleuzean perspective in philosophy and try to operationalize it into social sciences. It becomes a little bit difficult, but we can talk about it some other times. But it's the way that social development happens into a society. It responds to this, this differentiation as well. And the problem is to actually try to see how the differentiation happens and how much, is being coded and recorded within society of this moment of difference.
Well, and again, I think one of the big underlying thrusts of a lot of not just Deleuze's work, but Guattari's work is this understanding of, again, when we talk about the two regimes, and it's why I keep harping on this when we come back to the state, is that like the molar isn't like some other thing. It's just the aggregates. It's the same rules kind of apply here, that this is the same stuff. The way that, hey, Marx, you talked about how production works in society. Well, what if it was the same way in the mind? And but that goes the other way. As we start playing with how production works and subjectivity is produced, why would we not have the same conversation about the political subject in that at the molar? It's the rules for one go back and forth, and it becomes a really interesting discussion as we talk through how this has significant moments of, I don't know, for me, clarity, but also kind of leaps forward and having a discussion around how the state, for example, here, by divorcing it from capital, instead of saying we live in capital land, as I was joking earlier, we live in America, we live in a state, but the instantiation of it is not the same as all the other states. nor the original, but underlying it, there's this representation, this thing, this machine that's kind of been operating, and parts have fallen off and it's added parts and it's kind of hanging in the back now, but we love using it so much we don't even know that we are. And a lot of that applies to most of chapter 1 and 2. When we talk about how the unconscious works and the apparatuses we don't realize we're stuck with, the fascist within. Just my thoughts. I could be wrong. Well, with that, I didn't realize we are still recording. Does anyone have any questions on this? Because while you're here, you've got Roger and Varun, who, sorry, Jack, I love you too, way better read on this shit than Jack or me. So if you have questions, now would be the time, and if you use them while they're here. Or ask one of the questions you had earlier and see if they give the same answer as we did. That would be funny. Don't worry, Roger. It's a quiet group. No one's going to ask a question. I don't think anyone's asking a question. So with that, I will end the stream, end the setup. Thank you so much for joining us. And thanks for joining us, Roger Varun. Don't run away. I'll hang out for a minute. I'm just going to end the recording and say thank you so much. We will see you next week as we move into the civil